Hello, everybody. I'm Marcos Molitzis. I'm here with Carrie Eleveld. Welcome to our weekly show about politics, Daily Kos, The Brief. We have a great show for you today. We're going to be talking about the future of the Republican Party, if the current party has any hope of emerging from its sort of Q abyss that it is currently on. We're also going to be talking about rural America and just sort of this perception that this is all about white people. But in fact, there are a lot of people of color, voters of color in rural America. It's the reason we want Arizona and Georgia. And so we're going to see where else could we make some gains with rural, and could we even make some gains with white rural voters? So we're going to be talking to Sarah Longwell. She is a prominent anti-Trump Republican. She really has a sort of taken action. It's not all words. She's the founder of several organizations that have focused on trying to rip the Republican Party away from Trumpism. And we're going to be talking to Matt Hildreth. He's the executive director of ruralorganizing.org about rural America. So, Carrie, just before we get started with our guests, I've been sort of amazed at the Republican Party and their reaction to the COVID relief bill. Right? They're threatening Democrats with withholding all their votes. They're saying, since you're not listening to us, we're not going to give you any votes. And I can't think of a better political outcome than a 100% Democrat-Republican split on the COVID relief bill, because then the messaging in 2022 is so crystal clear, right? One party helped you out. The other party did its best to not help you out.
Right.
What are they thinking? What's going on over there?
My question is, who the heck are their pollsters polling? I mean, there's been problems with polls, but when you have, this COVID relief bill and most of the elements of it, right, especially including the $1,400 direct payments to struggling Americans, especially including, money for state and locales to make sure that their police departments and fire departments continue to be funded, that they can, try to use the money to get back to school, open up the schools. I mean, this is incredibly, these poll well individually and as a package very well. So I haven't seen hardly any polling, whether you look at, Quinnipiac, traditional poll like that, or if you look at a YouGov poll, it polls at around 70% with a really high majority support among Republicans, even Republican voters. So the Quinnipiac poll was around 68%. The YouGov poll was around 83%. So it all depends, a little bit on
it looks like
how
Biden
you word
is uniting. Biden is uniting the party. And what's really interesting is that none of the Republican conservative pollsters are releasing any numbers on this. So there's no even counter messaging that America doesn't like this creeping socialism or whatever nonsense they're calling it today. And so I just can't understand why they would make these threats, what they think they're doing, and how do they think this is not going to bite them in the ass? I mean, what does that 2022 messaging look like for them?
I don't know. And also, is it creeping socialism? Because you didn't call it creeping socialism when you did it while Trump was president, right? Because it's like they did pass COVID relief bills while Trump was president. The only difference now is Biden's president, and they don't like the price tag on it. Well, welcome. They were plenty happy to add $2 trillion to the debt for rich people in corporate America, but they just can't.
And their wars as well. Yeah, no, they have no problem spending the money unless it's actually helping people. And suddenly they have this big problem. And I think part of it is they're operating on this sort of, antiquated notion that bipartisanship means having votes from Republicans. And of course, that Republicans never cared about getting Democratic votes for their priorities, right? So this has always been a one-way street. But in fairness, Democrats have been susceptible to that, right? Obama was always so desperate to get Republican votes that it actually hamstrung his agenda for years, and I think led to the 2010 Republican wipeout of Democrats. And now you have Biden who says, no, bipartisanship isn't Mitch McConnell. Why would it be? Bipartisanship is America. And like you just pointed out, the polling is very clear that these measures have strong support even among Republicans. And I think that's very important to note because Mitch McConnell doesn't get to decide what's bipartisan anymore.
I will say, I think part of the problem for Mitch McConnell is you talked about this antiquated notion of, this antiquated notion of what they're trying to do. Part of it is that I think the Republican Party is sort of groundless right now, right? Are they the party of Trump, or are they a party of conservative principles? Well, I mean, I would say they're a little bit of both. But they're way more a party of Trump right now than they are conservative principles. And so when they don't have anything that really unifies, when they can't give an elevator pitch for their own party, they've decided that what they're going to do is just be the anti-Democrat, Biden, anti-COVID relief party. Okay. And this is, to me, a totally antiquated strategy born of 2009, 2010, when it worked fairly well for them, when they were able to recapture the House in the first 2 years in the midterms, after opposing everything Obama did and everything Democrats wanted to do. The problem is for McConnell is it's not the same caucus. He doesn't have the iron grip on the caucus that he did. And nothing made that more apparent than his inability to lead the caucus through this post-Trump era, when he could have cut ties with Trump, and it would have been hard, but they could have said, hey, we're going to be the party of conservative principles. We're going to get back. We're going to extricate this whole, and exile this whole cult of personality situation. And we're going to get back to being who we are. And he wasn't able to do that. He didn't have the the political juice in his caucus to do it, number one. And the voters, the voting base changed enough during the Trump era that the GOP base is no longer, it really is, they're trying to have this hybrid of these two different competing notions of what the party is. In any case, he's heading into battle with this 2009, 2010 playbook, but the army he's leading into battle in terms of the voters and the GOP caucus in the Senate, it's not the same. It's not the same caucus. It's not the same voting base, and it's not the same army he's leading to the battle. And it's just, I think it's a recipe for disaster for them.
Yeah, I'm interested in what Sarah Longwell has to say in a little bit when we bring her on about that, because she's somebody who actually has talked to these people. Might be from the outside seeing these hidden deplorables, these Trump-only voters, is they don't have a single conservative bone in their body. I don't even think they could speak to what those principles are supposed to be. That's why they're trapped in Q land, and Trump is the Messiah, whatever that weird messaging is that they have. And this is where Republicans have a problem, because they need to bring those voters back from the fold. But here's a sort of question. This relief bill has a child tax credit that pays out monthly. It's $360, I think, if it's under 6, and 6 and over, it's $300 a month. I'm not sure why older children get less money, because they're just as expensive, if not more. But this is a monthly tax credit that's going to be mailed by the IRS to families that meet certain income thresholds, which is a lot of America. And so I can see even Q-aligned voters looking at that check and realizing if it's between keep getting that check or voting Republican, it might not be that easy of a decision to make. And so again, it leads me back to this idea. These are not, and you said it's a different electorate. These are not Republicans who are like all about small government and fiscal responsibility and, oh heavens, the deficit, it's so high, right? They don't care. They don't even understand those things. They probably don't even know they exist as concepts. But if you got a check coming in and you have to vote between not getting that check anymore, you may have some interesting dynamics at play in 2022.
Right. Well, I think we should bring Sarah Longwell in. Let's do it, because we're right there. So Sarah Longwell is the founder. There she is. Yes. Sarah Longwell is the founder of the Republican Accountability Project and also Republican Voters Against Trump. And you may have seen these testimonials that Republican Voters Against Trump helped mine and then put out into the into the media sphere, where they had sort of these were everyday voters, Trump voters who voted for him in 2016, and then had the revelation that this was not a good idea and they were not going to vote for him in 2020, whatever their reasoning was. So it was kind of like the counterpart to the more slick Lincoln Project ads that were, produced and put on the air. This is a little bit more raw, revelatory, real people talking about why they changed their minds. And she's also publisher of The Bulwark. And Sarah Longwell and I have a history. We knew each other in DC. As I said last time, I was one of our core friend groups. For me and for her, we shared a core friend group where it was mostly Democrats and Sarah Longwell. So here she is. Hey, Sarah.
Guys, how's my audio?
Oh no, the audio's rough.
No, you're kidding me. We sound checked and everything.
It's better than it was last time, but the sound's still rough.
Your producer told me I sounded better than he did.
Wow.
Yeah, he did. He did, definitely. And
he's saying check the output. We could bring Matt Hildreth on board first to talk about rural voters and get back to Sarah. We could do that.
Yeah, let's do that.
We'll talk to Matt Hildreth first. Gosh, I hope we're able to get Sarah. She's like one of our best sources on what's happening in the Republican Party. But now we have Matt Hildreth, and I'm going to let you take it away, Marcus.
So Matt is the executive director, correct, of the ruralorganizing.org. He's focusing on trying to, you could say it better than I, but quite simply, we need better democratic performance in rural areas. They are traditionally sort of, what's the word we're looking for here? Neglected?
Yeah, that's kind. Thank you.
And maybe it's an understatement. But it's clear if you look at the 2020 results that particularly Arizona and Georgia, rural votes were critical. And people think when they think of rural America, me included, I'm just as guilty. I think white people. But it's not the case, right?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, so rural America is whiter when you look at the numbers than urban areas, but there's actually like 3 times more people of color in rural communities than farmers. So, the idea that we go straight from rural to farmer, that's only like 6% of the rural population. But when you're talking about rural people of color, it's a lot closer to 20%. And 20% is a lot of people nationally, but it's even more when you start looking at the South. And I think that's why we've had so much success in the South recently, is when you look at, I think Democrats have finally understood that rural doesn't mean white, and they've really, I think, leaned into rural communities of color, especially in places like Georgia and I think North Carolina as well, Arizona, as you mentioned, also.
So
yeah, go ahead.
Well, let me just go ahead and say, I know that you guys have, your organization has a new treasure trove of information about these voters, just rural voters overall, what worked and didn't work in 2020. And I think you did something like 60 exit interviews or something like that. We'd love to hear some of your takeaways from that information, just to kick off the conversation.
Yeah, so I mean, we have kind of 2 sets of data that we've been looking at. All last year, we did an extensive amount of public opinion research and polling, and then also we partnered with like Latino Decisions and a number of groups like NAACP and others on some election eve polling. So we have that data for analyzing kind of performance and things like that for voters. But then also what we've done since the election is we've set out what we call exit interviews, where we go through and actually talk to organizers, rural organizers on the front lines, actually working, knocking on the doors or making phone calls in a lot of cases this year with COVID, to actually hear from them about, what they're seeing in the communities. And so even there, when we look like the sample of rural voters that we're looking to really engage, it's like 30% are people of color. So there's this real strong investment that I think happened in 2020 that I hope will continue around organizing, like we said, specifically in Georgia, but also the Rural Utah Project did a lot of amazing organizing with the Navajo Nation in Arizona as well. So we've been talking to those people to really understand like what is happening and what is your take, because frankly, as we've seen, a lot of times the sort of K Street Beltway Democrats really just create their own narratives, and then people start building their campaigns off of stereotypes instead of actually what's happening on the ground.
So one of those narratives is that the AOC style of democratic politics is a big turnoff in rural America. What do you have numbers in your data that either support or reject that idea?
Yeah. So the most unpopular thing about Democrats is Democrats, like the name Democrats. Like there is a lot of I think hesitation around the Democratic national brand. I don't know that I would associate that directly to like AOC or Bernie. If you look at like how Bernie did in rural Iowa during the caucus, I mean, that's one of the more white rural states. Bernie actually did really well and a lot better than what people expected in rural communities. Elizabeth Warren as well. So I think that there's this old history of that like prairie populist, that progressive populist, best case scenario, that rural people really respond to. I think, like I always say, like if Fox News tells us something, like if Fox News could tell us that buttered toast is bad, there's a whole 30% of the population that's going to believe that. And a huge chunk of those people do live in rural communities. So I don't tend to really worry about what, Fox News is saying. And I don't think we should really build, strategies off of that. And the Fox News viewers probably don't appreciate AOC. But what she was right about when it comes to rural communities is Facebook. More rural people get their news from Facebook than Fox News. And she called out the Democrats for our failures engaging voters online. And I think that is one of the biggest things that she's right on about. And I think that is something that really resonates with the numbers we're seeing with rural voters.
And something that you mentioned to us that struck me was one of the biggest problems with rural voters and whether or not they have an allegiance to Democrats or Republicans is that they are interested in someone who's fighting for them. So is this person fighting for me? And their perception, regardless of whether the policies backed it up, right, was that Trump was a fighter for them and that Biden wasn't enough of a fighter for them. So that seemed to be, you were saying that progressive policies overall actually pull really well with these folks, but they don't think Democrats are actually fighting for them.
That's right. I mean, the disinformation in rural communities is really unbelievable. So we actually find that like rural people will agree with the statement that government should ensure affordable healthcare for all Americans, which, pollsters that you hear out of DC would sort of like never use that language. That language is still doing like 60, 70% among rural voters. But then whether you get into the disinformation is they actually think Republicans are the ones that are going to be able to, ensure that they have affordable health care. So we're really losing people on that. Yeah. On that partisanship. So that, I mean, I think that's just one example, but there are plenty of examples of the just sort of mind blowing numbers on how this all gets interpreted by the voter.
Are there any issues that are sort of core Democratic issues that actually do turn off rural voters? Are there anything where it's not misinformation, but yeah, legitimately they don't believe in, I don't know, more immigration or student debt relief or things like that?
Yeah. So, I mean, my motto just to say is lose less. So like, I just as like, I'm, building a majority, I think that it is going to come to running up the numbers in urban areas. And so like when you look at the cost benefit analysis on here, like we do need to run up the base numbers in rural areas or in urban areas while reducing the margins in rural communities. And so in that sort of context, I would say not really. But if you do look like at, for example, whether or not the Second Amendment abolishes all gun laws, that's above 50% in rural areas. And so that is a tougher one. But if you start talking about, school shootings and you talk about, machine guns and weapons of war, like you start getting into the mid to high 40% support. So you are underwater on those issues. But then if you add where we're at in the urban areas, like it really is not a liability as far as I'm concerned.
Okay.
Yeah. So when you did these exit interviews, what did people say? What's their prescription for trying to change how Democrats are perceived? Or did they have any success with that? Or was it simply reaching out to new voters that Democrats hadn't reached out to before that was more successful for them?
Yeah, so I think it's all a mix. I do think that, especially when we're talking about voters of color, like this whole project that I'm working on now started while I was in Steve King's congressional district. And if you look at where the progress in Iowa is happening right now, it's happening through groups like LULAC, bringing new voters to the table. And some of the best organizing in the whole state of Iowa is coming from those rural areas. So I think that's kind of the first piece of it. The other advice that we're getting from people is
And
like,
just to be, LULAC is focusing on the Latino vote. I just want people to understand.
Yeah. They're doing amazing work in Iowa. And so where we're seeing progress is in these immigrant meatpacking communities because LULAC is organizing. So that is, you see that in like Dodge City, Kansas as well. I mean, there are a number of immigrant communities across the Midwest and South where that type of organizing is shifting things. So bringing new people to the table, I think, is in a really important piece of this. But the voters that I'm really interested in are not the Obama-Trump voters. I think so much was played on the Obama-Trump voter. I'm in Ohio now, so I'm interested in the Sherrod Brown Donald Trump voter. And I still think we don't fully understand that dynamic, or the John Tester, Trump voter. And I think that when you look at the Democrats that do well in those states, even in the white rural states, it's because they understand a progressive message when it comes to the economy, when it comes to workers, and they're able to pull together kind of this, I think, racial justice message and connect it with this extraction and exploitation message that you get from somebody like Sherrod Brown when he's talking about coal communities in Appalachia, Ohio. And I think that there's a lot to learn as we move forward, even in places like Pennsylvania that has a much higher white rural population, but there's still so much we can do for engaging these workers and connecting, a narrative that really focuses on empowerment instead of exploitation.
So, it's actually interesting that John Tester, Sherrod Brown are really good examples, but those are also two states that other Democrats have had difficulty. And we just had an analysis released by Daily Kos Elections that showed that we are most polarized in the lowest number of ticket splitters in decades. I forget the number, but it's a big number. And so I do wonder, would John Tester survive an election with Donald Trump at the top of the ticket? There's a question about how many of those Donald Trump voters will turn out for not Donald Trump, of course, right? But would John Tester survive? Would Sherrod Brown survive, losing Ohio by 8 points, but winning that Senate seat? Do you think there's still those Democrats still have that ability to pull in that vote?
I mean, I think we need some real talk about that. I think that those are great questions. The perception is in Montana, when you talk to the organizers, and I'll even throw in South Dakota, going back as far as Daschle, that there was a time when, in South Dakota, that Democrats knew how to engage the indigenous communities. And the Democrats, since Daschle, have really lost sight of that. And if you look in South Dakota, the highest Democratic voting counties are also the lowest participation counties on the reservations. You also hear that with Tester in Montana as well. So I do think that there's something to be said about the Democrats that know how to engage Native communities. We see that in Arizona, of course, as well. But a state like Ohio or like, West Virginia, at some point we just got to say, we have to be real about what can be done. I do think it would be tough to see, Sherrod Brown and Donald Trump. I think Sherrod Brown is also moving backwards compared to other voters, or compared to other years with rural voters. But I'm not ready to give up yet. At the same time, you mentioned Mississippi before, we got on this call. If you look at places in the South where you have rural voters of color, I do think that's where the opportunities really are. And I think we have to keep coming back to that because in the states where you have emerging Black leadership and the progressive infrastructure getting behind them, that's where we're seeing the success more than anything.
So what's the next Georgia, the next place where Democrats are able to engage enough new rural voters, many of whom are people of color, in order to flip flip the state?
Yeah, North Carolina would be the first one I would go to. I mean, we've had success there in the past, and it was so close this last time. If you look at our numbers, when we did the analysis looking at rural communities, there was a lot of really, forward progression. It wasn't enough. The rural numbers are, I think, a little bit hard to read because Trump did see a wave election in rural America, while Democrats also improved over their 2016 numbers. So yes, Trump did better than Democrats because he had a wave in rural America. I'm not trying to downplay that or deny that, but also Democrats did bring up their rural numbers compared to 2016. Mm-hmm. And so it was sort of like two simultaneous wave elections happening, in the same time, talking to two completely different universes. But if you do look at I think the groundwork that's being laid in North Carolina, groups like Poder or Down Home, they're just doing amazing work. And I think that's where the real opportunity is going to be moving forward.
Carrie, we need to get some of those groups on the show for sure.
We will.
And to put sort of context to what you just said, man, and I've talked about this before in the show, but for everybody to understand that, Donald Trump got 350,000 more votes in Georgia than he did in 2016, but we won the state because Joe Biden got 600,000 more votes. And what's amazing is that in the southwestern counties of Georgia, which are heavily Black, heavily African-American, the voter turnout increased dramatically in the runoff election in January. And historically, Democrats have always underperformed in runoff elections. So much so that it was by design. It was a Jim Crow anti-Black law. And of course, now Georgia Republicans want to change that because it's no longer suppressing the Black vote. So it's lost its purpose. But I didn't even know there was a Georgia Black rural vote until maybe a year ago when I was at a meeting of progressive leaders and they were talking about this Georgia rural Black vote. And I was like, it can't be that many people. Can you give us a sense of just in raw numbers, how many people we are talking about in states like North Carolina and
yeah. So North Carolina, it's like 11% of the total voting population are voters, rural voters.
Of the entire state.
Of the entire state. And then when you get into Georgia, it's 14%. So if you're talking about in both states, just rural voters, a third are voters of color. So, I mean, and then when you get into Mississippi is a heavily rural state. It's almost like depending on how you cut rural, that's
almost all of it, right?
Yeah. It's almost literally 90%. A third of the whole voting population in Mississippi are rural voters of color. So you look at these states and it's just, I think we've completely forgotten about it. About this whole dynamic. And I think that Democrats, as we start getting back, progressives, that we start getting back into that footing, I think we're gonna be in a much better place.
Yeah, I wonder if we've forgotten it or we just, I mean, first of all, obviously communities of color don't get a lot of attention to begin with.
Yep.
And then you take them out of the places where you'd run into them, right? I mean, rural Latino, an urban community of color, they're right there. People who live in the city see them. But when you're talking about rural America, it's kind of hidden in general to people who don't live in those small towns. So I don't even know if it's a question of we forgot they were there, but more of like, holy crap, these people exist and there are voters, and there was never really any effort to reach those voters. And it's still a logistical challenge, right? Because in a city you have numbers and you have density and it's easier to reach mass number of people. How do you reach these winnable, gettable voters that are Democratic leaning in rural America? How do you reach them?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think there's like a few very specific ways. I think AOC was right about just the need to be better online and be better on Facebook and make better content. We've started working with progressive rural comedians, and they are way better at engaging rural Southern voters than
cool.
us with policies. But then you look at like the local organizing that's happening in these communities. You have to trust the base. I mean, I think that's the number one thing we keep running into is we can do distributed organizing. You have to do distributed organizing in small towns and rural communities, and in order to do that, you have to ask people more than to just click to sign a petition. Like this collectivism is killing us. Like the whole point is to get people to organize their community, not to just sign our petitions. And I think that's a little bit of a mindset change. You look at groups like, giving Indivisible credit, their rural membership, I think people would be shocked to figure out how big, their rural membership is. And those people just wanted to be able to, get pointed in the right direction, get some resources. And they kind of had this mentality that we'll take it from there. And so I think regardless of which community you're talking about in rural areas, that is a common thread, that just trusting that local leadership and sort of resourcing them is the best way to do it. Because if we try and do it, marching orders, one community at a time, it's just too big to scale.
I mean, once again, is the best way for instance, our listeners to find these smaller groups and in the states and click donate. I mean, is that the smash that donate button is to pick out these smaller groups and just donate to them so that they'll have the resources to build the infrastructure? Is that what we need?
I think so. I mean, and I think it does. And I think that, getting past this like urban rural divide, I mean, there's so much that folks in larger cities can do in terms of resourcing local leadership. And New Georgia Project would be a great one. Poder in North Carolina is another one. Down Home is another one. I mean, these are people that are doing, the tough work, day in and day out. And I think that those places where we get easier progressive wins, if we could start, volunteering time or resources to help expanding the base, I think in these other communities, that would be a big win for all of us.
Matt, thank you so much for joining us. It's always such a pleasure. You're our second repeat guest, and I'm excited to have you on. You're always so insightful, and I'm going to admit this, and I hate to say this, but I'm going to say it anyways, is I had this sort of bias against rural America, right? I just, this bitterness. I'm such a coastal elite when it comes to rural America. And so it's really refreshing to see that I shouldn't be, number one. Number two, there are gettable votes. I mean, you said 11% of the population of North Carolina is communities of color in rural counties. We only lost the president and the Senate races by 3 points, right? I mean, we have the votes to win if we do the organizing. And so seeing rural America as sort of the enemy that we need to offset with urban America and the changing suburbs, really it sort of shortchanges both our allies in those rural communities that need all the help that we can offer them, but also just shortchange simple math. The people are there that can help us win these close states, and they can help us make states like Mississippi competitive, and South Carolina and Texas. And so, I really appreciate having you on to really help me sort of shift my mind. And I'm hoping some of our listeners do as well, because I'm sure I'm not alone.
Can I ask one last question real quick? If Democrats pass this COVID relief bill, is that a message that Democrats would be able to take to rural voters and say, we did this for you?
Absolutely. I was listening to the first part of the show, and I 100% agree with you. I mean, this is where we're missing the opportunity. Is not only do we have to pass these progressive popular policies, but we have to let the voters know that we did that. And I think that the fewer Republicans that get on these things, like the better, right? It makes it so much clearer who is actually fighting for these communities. The thing I will say is we can't just say it on our media channels. We have to break through, I think, the online, disinformation web to really reach voters where they're at. And I think that's going to be the challenge moving forward.
Put Joe Biden's big ass signature in every check, just like Donald Trump did.
Thank you, Matt. We appreciate you.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate the invite.
Thanks. Yeah, no, I mean everything that I said. It's so easy to lose track of the importance of rural America. Not the Q crowd, like they're lost to Fox News land. But that's not rural America. And equating the two really does everybody a disservice, including myself. So I'm so happy to have him on to sort of remind me about that importance.
Well, and we obviously have a North Carolina episode coming up. We may have a Mississippi at some point, but we need to have a North Carolina episode soon, because that's going to be one of the major battlegrounds in 2022. So.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to get Sarah on. So I think the issue for salt. Yeah.
Guys, just let me talk. Can you hear me? Tell me, can you hear me?
Oh my God.
We're still having trouble. I don't know what the deal is. I don't know why we can't get you, man. I'm
against Republicans.
Yeah. Conspiracy against Republicans. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Walter wants you to check that output and make sure it's highlighted. Is it highlighted?
Yes, that is. And what about this? And this is the input.
Oh man.
Okay, what about now?
No,
it's just not. I mean, we can kind of decipher what you're saying, but it's just not good enough. I mean, this is why we thought we'd bring you on, and now we're just going to say a bunch of nasty stuff about you. Or maybe it's your conspiracy against progressives. Are you trying to kill our radio show? I mean, what's the deal?
I don't know what to do.
Yeah.
Oh, is the Yeti off? The Yeti, is it off? Let's see.
Yeah.
We might not get her. We might not get her. Oh, it's sad, because here's the thing. And, maybe somewhere down the road we'll be able to work this out. But we need a good guest on about the Republican Party and what it's going through. Partly because we were talking about earlier this whole idea that they're going to oppose this COVID relief bill, that they're going to try and replay this 2009 effort, and at the same time they are just so, their approval numbers, their favorability numbers are tanking. And on top of it all, of course, you have these tens of thousands of GOP defections among voter affiliations in the last, there's some question, was it after the November elections, or was it right after the January 6th riot where it spiked, these GOP defections? But whatever the reason, there is definitely an increased and anomalous, an unusual number of GOP defections among voters right now. And, we're unclear. I think the data is still a little unclear on whether or not those defections are coming from people who are pro-Trump and don't think the Republican Party is pro-Trump enough, or if they're coming from people who are just disgusted by what happened on January 6th and what has become of the Republican Party. And based on the data points I've seen, I think it leans towards the people who are anti-Trump and disgusted by what the party's become. But I do think they're losing voters on both sides of that equation. Anyway, we definitely
they are losing voters on both sides of the equation. I would, if I had to guess, an educated guess, not a made up guess, but an educated guess, is that it is sort of the old school Republicans, and they've been bleeding that support in the suburbs. The location of these changing registrations are in suburban areas, right? So these are not areas that are hotbeds of Trumpism. And if you're a Trump Republican, there's no reason for you to abandon the party. The party's still Trump's party, and he's made it very clear that he's not letting go. And Mitch McConnell signaled that he can't let it go. And I actually think Democrats offered him up and out on a silver platter. They gifted him a way to say, we're going to chop this cancer out of our party. And he was unwilling or unable to do so. And so you are seeing the slow erosion. And their problem isn't going to be the people who are changing registration. The problem is going to be like the Dixiecrats, people who remain registered Republicans, but start voting differently over time. And they're just too lazy to change parties.
Right. And that's right. Exactly. I mean, the numbers themselves are not huge numbers, but they are indicative of a larger wave of discontent is what it is.
Absolutely.
And what I was writing about today is the fact that if what we're seeing is more of a defection on the side of the traditional Republicans who have been lifelongers, who can't stand what's happening to the party, then what's going to happen with these GOP primaries, where they're trying to find, candidates to run a statewide race in Georgia, in North Carolina, in other places, in Ohio, is you're going to get the Trumpiest of those, because a lot of people have just said they're washing their hands. I mean, I literally read a quote from some woman who was like, I'm just voting in Democratic primaries now because it's the only place where I feel like I have a say of maybe trying to make the party a little bit more centrist. So, so that I have a candidate that I'm excited about voting for. So, but if those people aren't voting in the Republican primary, if the moderates aren't, they're going to get the Trumpiest candidates they can. They're going to end up by default getting the Trumpiest candidates possible for these races. And that's going to be a killer for them in any of these competitive states and in some of the most competitive districts in the House too.
Yeah, no, I mean, it could be a double-edged sword. I mean, definitely, I don't think it helps them. Wait, Sarah?
Guys, can you hear me? Please tell me you can.
No.
We can hear you, but we just can't hear you well enough. I mean, it's better, but...
Can you hear me now? Better?
No.
I have no idea. I'm really sorry.
We're sorry. We'd love to have you. But anyway, we're not going to be able to get Sarah Longwell this time, and maybe we'll get her in another episode. But anyway,
we'll
sorry, go ahead.
The code. Yeah, we'll have to crack that code. It could be a double-edged sword, because do we really want a bunch of what are old school Republicans voting in Democratic primaries, also affecting our ability to elect progressive candidates? Now, if they're electing Joe Biden types of quote centrists, which he's come out of the gate incredibly progressive, I'm actually okay with that. But if they're helping nominate less than ideal Democrats, it could be an issue. But at this point, I'm not overly worried about it.
I'm not overly worried about it either. And the reason I say that is because I think the center of gravity in the Democratic Party has shifted. And if Joe Biden is able, with his, with pretty much solely Democrats, it looks like, able to pass a COVID relief bill, start to get the economy humming again, which is already starting to look, like it's making some gains now. Get people back to work, get the schools open, things like that. Then I think that the new mantra in the Democratic Party is we got to be aggressive. If we have to go it alone, okay. Our democratic policies play well, and if they perform well, especially in 2022, and Democrats are able to keep control of Congress, then regardless of whether we have some moderating forces, of people voting in the Democratic primaries, Democrats are still going to end up on the better side of that equation, because whatever becomes of the Republican Party, it's going to be so Trumpy. And I don't think that's good for the country. I honestly don't think it's good for the country. But at least the short-term politics of that play better for the Democrats than they do for the Republicans.
Yeah. I mean, the danger is that we're one low turnout election away from electing seditionists, insurrectionists, fascists. And so it's a little bit scary. So we are going to have Carolyn Fiddler on. She's going to join us. She is Daily Kos's Director of Communications, but she's also an expert on state legislatures. And when we're talking about this battle of the Republican Party and the Civil War, a lot of that is playing out in state legislatures. So Carolyn, thanks for joining us on short notice.
Delighted to be here.
So where are you seeing these battles play out? I assume they're happening all over the country, right? Between moderate and conservative Republicans?
They are, but the conservatives are winning. I've been watching the machinations of state legislatures for longer than I care to admit, and I find myself thinking a lot about 2010, when Republicans won a bunch of elections and took a lot of majorities, and how you had sort of your moderates that came to power, and they did implement a lot of really conservative things really quickly, but you didn't have your extremists like really wielding a lot of power. But now you do.
Yeah.
And what does that look like?
That looks like people using the big lie of Trump winning the presidential election to justify a whole new swath of voter suppression laws, which they wanted to do anyway, but they are still using this great falsehood to support this. And however you feel about these voter suppression laws, I mean, everyone should be against them, but however you feel about them, basing them on this big lie is terrible.
Right. Well, so you're talking about from a governance standpoint, and it is terrible. And Democrats are going to spend the next 2 to 4 to 10 years battling against those suppression efforts. Right. But from an electoral standpoint in 2022, we're already starting to see where this sort of extremism that you're talking about is causing problems for them having more moderate candidates, more statewide digestible candidates. And like one of those places, of course, is Pennsylvania, where you have, I think, former Representative Ryan Costello, right, who wants to run a statewide race to replace Pat Toomey as the Republican senator there. But already he's warring with these factions of kind of extreme GOP factions that are pushing the big lie, that are, that are way right of center. And there's already a conflict, as I understand it. And you're probably even following this more closely than I am, Carolyn, in terms of what's happening there, and whether or not that could kill his bid to be a more moderate force and therefore more palatable to more voters in a statewide election.
You raise a really, really good point in terms of like where the Republican Party is now in the immediate wake of Trump, and he's still very much a force in the party, as you said, and it's creating these factions. And as a Democrat, I hate to see it, but it is bad for the governance of the country. But it is going to help Democrats electorally in these statewide races to have a choice between reasonable and very, very extreme. However, once you get below the statewide level, you're gonna have a whole new set of problems brought about by the next round of redistricting. So
what about the House? What about if you look at the congressional districts? Is this where this is going to come? You know, it could play to Democrats' favor in the statewide races. What about the House?
We're screwed.
Oh boy.
We might get to run in 2022 on the current set of maps because the census is so screwed up. We might not have the data in time. So we might get one more election where Democrats, are running in districts that are not specifically newly tailored to elect more Republicans. But if it's not 2022, it's going to be 2024 when we're going to get a whole new set of maps that are going to screw screw Democrats in the U.S. House and in state legislatures all across the country.
Is the fact if we get a mulligan in 2022 under the existing boundaries, do we have another chance to win the redistricting battle in some of these key states by taking some state legislatures maybe and drawing the maps with different legislature?
We absolutely have a chance. But in a midterm election with a Democrat in the White House, it is going to be extremely challenging. But yes, there is a real emergency.
Yeah,
we get that.
I mean, that's a real question, right? Because I think in a traditional normal election cycle, absolutely, we're headed for some losses next year. But clearly, there's nothing normal and routine about this election season. One, we don't know if those Trump-only voters are going to actually turn out and vote. That was a big factor in the ability of Republicans to limit that down ballot damage. But also this clear messaging. I mean, are you seeing anything in the state level, at that state level, on how passage of this coronavirus relief bill, this $1.9 trillion bill, might help Democrats, those down ballot races?
It very well could. A lot of it's going to depend on how it is administered on the state level. So places that are currently run by Republicans, that could cut both ways. Could get credit, or Republicans could get credit. A lot's going to become known in the next several months when this bill finally gets passed in Congress and we start seeing those effects.
Would that just take the cake if Democrats, if it becomes a party line vote where Democrats pass this thing, and then the state and local money goes to out to all the states, and the Republican governors manage to somehow take credit for this stuff without Republicans having voted for it in Congress? I mean, that would be fascinating, and like a fascinating set of, sort of like disinformation campaign for the Republicans to be running on the state level.
Right. I mean, it's smart politics on one level to do that, but on the other, the flip side of that is they have to be seen as embracing Biden to do that. And that is an innate liability right now for Republicans. So
is Biden the boogeyman? And again, we're talking down at this sort of most grassrootsy state legislature level. Is Biden the kind of boogeyman that a Hillary Clinton or a Barack Obama or a Hillary Clinton, Nancy Pelosi, anybody that's not an old white guy, right? Has he become a boogeyman at this point yet? I'm not seeing it, but I'm also not that plugged in at that level.
You raise a good point. It's not as bad, partially because you mentioned Hillary Clinton. Republicans spent decades vilifying her, making her into that boogeyman. They didn't spend that time and effort on Biden for whatever reason. So he does not have as much baggage as some of his other Democratic counterparts might. So
also on top of that, we did that interview with Kathleen Friedel and she was a historian, and she was saying too that just his style is Biden's style is to not be in your face, so he doesn't sort of offer up all these opportunities that maybe some Democrats other Democrats do just by virtue of, some cases it's just by virtue of their race or their gender that they offer up opportunities. But on top of him not offering up those opportunities to just be, purely racist, purely sexist, he just doesn't emote this sort of anti-Republican feel that some Democrats, kind of do just by virtue of who they are. So I think it's hard. It's much harder for them to vilify him, not only because they haven't been doing it for decades, but because he doesn't have this really strong personality push that he's constantly sort of in people's face.
Right. And on the campaign, you saw that he can be a little bit sort of pugilistic. He can bring that sort of fighting spirit when he wants to, but he's being so smart right now and being real chill, real about as middle of the road as you can be in terms of like things that are popular with the American people. He's not sniping at Republicans in the Senate. He could, but it's not going to do any good. So I think he's playing really smart politics right now. And I think that is going to be to Democrats' benefit down the ballot. And even if he's not a Republican boogeyman, I think that Republicans will still not be able to embrace him or his aid in the coming months.
So, Caroline, I know you came in last minute, and I don't mean to put you on the spot because, of the question you may not be able to answer off the top of your head. But I'm curious with this idea of a mulligan on redistricting, and are there any states that would be obvious targets for flipping legislatures to help us on the redistricting front?
Oh, goodness. Yes, of course I know the answer to this.
I teed up the big, juicy softball for you.
That was gorgeous. Top of that list is absolutely the Texas House.
Yes.
Pennsylvania is also very high on that list, as well as the Michigan House. Those would be, I believe, my top vote getters for that contest, for sure.
Yeah, I think we're going to have to really work on directing a lot of progressive energy and activism towards those seats in those state legislative races. And they're not as sexy as the top of the ballot races, but they're going to be so critical to our ability to even hold a house, to even have a speaker. I think Pelosi is going to retire after this term, but for another Democratic speaker. And so I'm glad those are three big, critical, important states. And they also happen to be battleground states. And I laugh when I look at the Senate map for 2022 because it's the exact same states we had to fight over last year, right? It's Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Georgia, Arizona. I think we have Arizona again.
North Carolina. Yeah, Arizona.
North Carolina, Florida. It's all the same states. But if we can sort of double up, and if we're fighting for that Pennsylvania Senate seat, and we're also looking at flipping a lot of those seats, and it might even line up with some of the stuff that Hildreth said. Some of these, districts actually have rural components in them that are flippable. So I think it's going to be very critical for us to focus on that, realize that there's a big holistic battle on the ballot beyond just the candidates that are running.
Absolutely.
So let's see.
What's your parting thought for us, Caroline? If you have a parting thought, talk about a softball. I mean, it might be too big a question, but what's your parting thought for what people should be keeping in mind going into the 2022 elections? And let's be clear, too, that Republicans with the redistricting thought that they might pick up like a half dozen seats, right? Just from redistricting alone, that they could pick up a half dozen seats. And that's basically like what Democrats control the House by right now. So they thought they could pick up what they needed just by redistricting alone in order to pick up a majority in 2022. So anyway, I just want to be clear about that for people, because I think people didn't, not everybody pays attention to that, what the numbers are. But anyway, if you had a parting thought for viewers to go away with, something that they could do something about, what would it be?
My parting thought would be to pay attention to what's happening in your state legislatures right now. Almost all of them, all across the country, whatever state you live in, it's almost certainly in session right now. And those lawmakers, your lawmakers, are passing bills, passing laws that are going to affect your day-to-day life. It's not all voter suppression. It's things like your school funding. There's a lot of COVID relief moving through legislatures now. Not as much as we'd like, but yes, things are happening every day at the state legislative level right now. And I would say, take a look at that. I know things in DC are very sexy. They're much more attention getting, and it's easier to find news about what's happening in DC than it is in your local, town or state. And that's unfortunate. That's a whole other discussion about the media and where the local press is right now. But I would say seek out that information, become attuned to what's happening in your state capital.
Thank you so much, Carolyn. We appreciate you joining us on such last minute notice. That was really great of you.
I'm glad to be here.
All right. It amazes me that we may get a mulligan on redistricting because of Donald Trump's incompetence in running anything, including the census.
Something about that would just be so on brand if he managed to screw Republicans out of being able to retake the House because he was so incompetent, and also for them because they supported him the whole time. Anyway, let's fingers crossed on that one, right?
Yeah, so, I'm hoping that and that there's no real rush or hurry in the Biden administration to get these numbers out and to drag it out. But the fact is, I say that almost facetiously, they fundamentally effed up the census. And so they're going to have to go back out in the field and they're going to have to plug a lot of holes because ironically, they were trying to rush and get it done before. Actually, I don't know why they were rushing to get it done because they should have had it done last year. So I'm not sure what their rationale was.
I think part of it got behind schedule, I think, because of the pandemic too. So the whole process should have taken, what they should have done was given the whole time, the whole process, the amount of time span and gave it the possibility to breathe that it really needed. And instead they were trying to truncate the process in order to, cut immigrants out of the
the immigrant stuff was, so there's some legal hang-ups there. It's they had to readjust because they were trying to count. They're trying to get a census of undocumented immigrants so that then they could, for their political agenda. Well, the census is very clearly says persons. There's no notion in the Constitution about anything having to do with immigration status. So that also hamstrung them. But it would be ironic, and I really do hope that there's no real hurry in the Biden administration to fix that. And given how much they've had to unwind in all of these agencies, we haven't even seen them start working on the U.S. Postal Service, right, which was royally effed up. It may take a while, and it would only be poetic justice.
I just want to make one last point about something that Carolyn said that's sort of near and dear to my heart because I used to do local reporting. And that is just the hollowing out of the people, the coverage, the access to news. So I think it's really, she said, hey, pay attention to what's happening in your own state legislature. And it's hard in many places to even get access to that information. And it makes it so much easier for Republicans to sell their base on lies about what's happening in the state legislature because there isn't good reporting in so many, this is sort of like a news,
the local newspapers have been decimated, so they don't exist anymore. This is why, as Matt was talking about, so much of rural America gets its news from Facebook because traditional news outlets have all been decimated. So it's Fox News and Facebook. That seems to be a lot of the news diet. And probably neither of those options really gives you an idea of what's happening at the state level. So the question then doesn't become, what is my state legislator doing in my state capital, Springfield, Illinois, or whatever it might be. It's, he's Democrat, like those evil Democrats in DC. And then it becomes one and the same. And it makes it harder to really differentiate yourself unless your state is shifting like a Virginia or a Colorado, where you just ride the wave into the majority. So that's all the time we have for our show today. Thanks, everybody. Thanks to Matt Hildreth for joining us. Thank you to Carolyn Fiddler for her last minute save. Thanks to Walter Einenkel for joining us. Please like, subscribe, follow, whatever it is at your favorite, either YouTube, Facebook Live, or your favorite podcasting platform. Really appreciate you guys joining us this week, and we will see you next week. Thank you very much.